Historical trauma is defined as a complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. The term was first used to describe the burden on children of Holocaust survivors during the past few decades. And since then, historical trauma has been a weight in the lives of Armenian refugees, Japanese survivors of internment camps, Swedish immigrant children whose parents were torture survivors, Palestinian youth, and many others that have a history of oppression and victimization. Historical trauma can be described as a process of three connecting phases. First, there is a mass devastation perpetuated onto a population by a dominant culture. Next, the original population responds to the devastation. Finally, successive generations receive the impacts of the devastation and subsequently respond to the trauma with biological, societal, and psychological problems and symptoms. Symptoms of historical trauma are most commonly adopted through three methods: children identifying with their parents' suffering, children being influenced by the style of communication their caregivers use to describe the trauma, and children being influenced by particular parenting styles.
Impacts of historical trauma today include predisposition to PTSD, depression, survivor guilt, poor affect tolerance, unresolved grief, substance abuse, elevated mortality rates from cardiovascular diseases, and suicide. Experiencing trauma can also impact a person's neurological functioning. After experiencing something traumatic, people will often have an overactive amygdala. This hyperactivation could be the reason for symptoms of hyperarousal and PTSD, and the reason for a person re-experiencing the event due to a trauma reminder. The non-Hispanic Native American community continues to suffer to a greater degree than any other racial group. They are at a greater risk of experiencing psychological distress, as well as a greater risk of poorer overall physical and mental health. According to the CDC, in 2007, the suicide rates for Native American adults and youth were higher than the national average, with suicide being the second leading cause of death for Native Americans from 10 to 34 years of age. It wasn't until 1978 that a federal law restricting Native Americans from practicing cultural ceremonies was lifted under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. This law was originally enacted in 1883, and it contributed to the historical trauma that Native Americans continue to suffer from today due to their inability for 95 years to properly mourn the losses of those who died in their community.
To understand historical trauma, we must view it in the lens of a narrative that takes past events and connects them to present-day experiences. There are both public and personal reminders, including structural inequalities, public symbols, and microaggressions, in the lives of those that historical trauma affects. In order to improve the health of these individuals, both in the individual and community sense, their narratives must be represented as valid and meaningful. The degree to which this salience is promoted will, in turn, correspond to a lesser chance of negative health impacts. Each component of the narrative model is influential to the rest and provides a foundation for the way a person is understood.
One practice that has been found to have positive impacts on those recovering from trauma is the application of mindfulness. Mindfulness can be described as a practice of being aware and present and drawing novel distinctions, which may lead to four possible consequences, including a greater sensitivity to one's environment, increased openness to new information, creation of new categories for structuring perception, and an enhanced awareness of multiple perspectives and problem solving.
By understanding the concept of historical trauma, healthcare professionals will hopefully become more responsive to the needs of those suffering, and counselors will be able to incorporate historical healing into their clinical work. Counselors should be able to provide tribal-specific healing strategies, community support, and grief-validating approaches into their practices. Historical trauma is not just about what happened in the past, it's about what's still happening today. Research is still in high demand for Native American populations due to their underrepresentation in health research. In order to promote healing and change the dangerous current course of action, we need to acknowledge our role, whether on an individual or federal level, in discriminating against marginalized groups. In doing so, this will shift the narrative to support those that are suffering from historical trauma.